BackStory is made possible in part by KeyBank, with additional support from the League of Women Voters, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
In 1812, a political cartoonist coined a word that we are still using in American politics today, more than 200 years later. To gerrymander is to divide or arrange a district in such a way to give one party an unfair advantage over the other. Now, the cartoon was of a newly drawn Senate district at the hands of Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry back in 1812. It was a bizarrely shapen district, kind of looked like a salamander, so the cartoonist added an eye, some fangs, a tongue, some toes, and came up with the phrase that we use today. Now, many people have disliked gerrymandering since the very beginning, especially those on the losing ends of the map. And we have a chance this year to make some change in our area, to kind of make it right and maybe fix this issue once and for all, perhaps. Our three guests today are here to talk about that on BackStory. Jen Miller is the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters. For nearly 20 years, she's worked with diverse communities to promote social and environmental justice. Her passion is getting others involved in civic engagement. Dr. Melissa Miller is a professor of political science at Bowling Green State University. She is an expert on American politics with a focus on elections and voting behavior, women in American politics, public opinion, and the media. And finally, Dr. Deb Dalke is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Defiance College, and she's a redistricting volunteer for the League of Women Voters and Fair Districts. And she's giving Zoom presentations on the new redistricting process in Ohio and why you are needed, how the public can participate in this. Let's start out with why we are talking about this right now in 2021. I understand it has something to do with the census.
That's right, Jason. In fact, we're talking about redistricting in 2021 precisely because our country's founders mandated in the Constitution that there would be a census taken every 10 years. So a census was taken in 2020, and we're just now hoping to get the results from that census soon. But here's what the founders had in mind. They knew that the American population isn't sedentary and that people tend to move around both within and between states. And what that means is that every 10 years, you need to sort of count all of those citizens, all of those residents, I should say, and make sure that each state has the appropriate number of seats in the US House of Representatives based on that population. And then the states can use that information to draw their appropriate number of congressional districts according to where the population is situated within their borders. Now, later in the 1960s, the US Supreme Court ruled that congressional districts must be roughly equal in size, of course, because it wouldn't be fair if some Americans lived in a really small congressional district and got then, great representation because they were only of one of 150,000 constituents, whereas somebody else was in a congressional district with 1 million people, right? So congressional districts have to be drawn equally, and every 10 years, the census allows the states to draw those districts based on where the population has shifted. And by the way, those same rules apply to state legislative districts. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the logic of doing the census and drawing the districts every 10 years. The problem arises when a particular political party uses the redistricting process to lock in a partisan advantage.
And Jen, will you talk to us a little bit about how the redistricting works? How do we determine where those lines are drawn, and how gerrymandering has worked in Ohio in the past?
Hey, that's a great question. So every state has slightly different rules in terms of how they draw those state Senate and state House maps, as well as their congressional district map. Here in Ohio, we have a long history of what's called gerrymandering. So in fact, the league started fighting this concept of gerrymandering when Democrats were the ones who did it. And we are continuing to fight that now that it's something that happens with Republicans. So let's just back up in terms of a little psychology. If your team is strong, your team is in power, it makes complete sense that you would want to use that to continue your advantage. And so if you're thinking about it, every 10 years, what has been happening is the maps are getting created in a way that it secures that partisan advantage for Republicans year after year after year. Now, that's the case for Ohio. Again, both political parties do it. What does gerrymandering really mean? It means that instead of really drawing the map, the congressional district maps, in a way of really keeping communities together and counties together, they're splitting down neighborhoods, down counties, down jurisdictional lines, really with just the purpose of guaranteeing that Republicans will have an advantage. Maybe some Republican voters will think, well, I'm a Republican, so that should be great for me. But here's the problem, is that if you are running for office and you know that your party's going to win, or you're already in office and you know you'll win your seat again, you don't actually have to listen to voters. And what we see with partisan gerrymandering over time is that we get extreme partisan divides, which I think probably sounds very familiar to all of us. We get unresponsive elected officials who, again, know that they're going to win their election. They don't really need to work hard to represent the needs of voters. And we get really frustrated and confused voters about the system.
So 2021 is the year to redraw the maps essentially in Ohio, but understand in 2015 and 2018 there were constitutional amendments, state constitutional amendments that will change the way redistricting is done. Can you talk about some of the major highlights of those amendments?
Sure, absolutely. I'll jump in. So the league actually worked to bring constitutional amendments to the people starting in the 70s and 80s. And finally, because of volunteers like Debbie, all across the state, we were able to do that in 2015 and 2018. So just a few things. First off, these initiatives, probably a lot of you who are watching voted for it, because in 2015 it passed by almost 72% of the vote, in 2018 almost 75% of the vote. And it's really about encouraging the map makers, those who make those maps, to be bipartisan, to be transparent, to have public participation, and to keep communities together in a way so we don't see the kinds of sprawling districts that I think you're going to hear from Debbie, but instead districts that are more alike economically and politically and socially, and therefore it's easier for lawmakers to represent the needs of those voters.
And Dr. Dalke, Jen mentioned that this is very partisan. Now, you are holding these Zoom meetings in different areas, different spots across our area. Do you ever hear anyone, a Republican say, well, this is just a power grab by Democrats. They can't win in Ohio any other way, so they're trying to redraw the maps? And if so, how do you respond to that?
Well, I have actually never heard that. But one thing that I would say is I grew up in California, and I was staying at my brother's, who was a Republican. I'm a Democrat, and a Republican called to talk about the fact that there was going to be a redistricting initiative. And I said, yes, I'm voting for it. And he said, I've never encountered a Democrat who was going to vote for it. And I said, I want a fair fight. I want these districts to be drawn fairly so that we really have a competition of ideas. And what I would really like to talk about is why it is important to have these fair districts. Because if we have fair districts, then we can really better advocate for our needs. Because in some cases, our community is divided. I mean, take, for example, Lakewood. The picture behind me is of the Snake on the Lake district that runs from Toledo to the outskirts of Cleveland. So you live in Lakewood, just 5 miles from Cleveland, but you're not not in the district with Cleveland, you're in the district with Toledo. So if you have an issue, you're probably concerned with Cleveland, that you shop there, you may go to hospitals there, that you would be advocating, you would be writing to a representative for whom Cleveland was not in the turf. So we can better advocate for our communities if we can keep the communities together. And split communities confuse voters. We had a political scientist who does research on what happens in these split communities, and he said that the residents are less likely to know who is running for office. I mean, and imagine it if you look across the street and see a yard sign, and you see all that you're surrounded by yard signs, but they're for candidates who are not running in your district. And another thing that's important is if we have gerrymandered districts, then the composition of the legislature does not match the makeup of the voters. Ohio we were a swing state. It now looks like we're more leaning Republican, and we should see this in the legislature. We should have a composition of the legislatures that really matches how the population of Ohio as a whole feels. And what Jen mentioned is that safe seats can cause a politician to care more about what the donors want than what the constituents want. So I have been doing research, and looking online, I discovered that in 2018 here in Ohio, we had 8 unopposed state house races. And what that means is that the opposite party felt, well, there's no reason for me to even run. So we would like to see a competition of ideas.
If I can just add there, Deb, that there's another side effect that's tied into everything both you and Jen have said, which is when you gerrymander districts so that you've got a bunch of districts that will definitely elect a Republican, and then you have some other districts that will definitely elect a Democrat, why bother to vote when you know the outcome? And so what happens in highly gerrymandered states is that turnout tends to be somewhat lower. Now, 2020 was an exception for different reasons. There was high turnout because of what was happening at the national level. But all of the action ends up being in these primaries instead of in the general election, because whoever wins that primary in a Democratic district is going to win in November, or whoever wins it in the Republican district is going to win in November. And so just to kind of tie it up with a bow, some of the things that have been mentioned, that red district is likely to nominate somebody who's ideologically very conservative. And the Democratic district is going to nominate somebody who's ideologically very liberal. And that's why you end up with ideological, I don't want to overstate it, but extremists in our legislative bodies who can't compromise. And we end up with gridlock that frustrates everybody.
How do you do it fairly?
So there's a lot of ways to do it fairly, but first let's just one more measure, one kind of smell test, if you will, if a map is fair or not. So in Ohio, about any general election, about 55% of the statewide voters are Republican and about 45% are Democrat. And so what we have is almost 50-50 with a slight Republican advantage. But what happens is that in these maps that we have both in the state house and our congressional delegation is it's about 75% Republican. So that doesn't meet the smell test, right? We should see the maps be slightly more Republican representatives than Democratic representatives. So some of the things that we need to first understand is how we measure or look if something is an unfair partisan advantage. There's lots of ways to draw maps. The one thing I will say is and last time, or the last several times, we had almost no transparency in the process. It was very difficult for groups like the League of Women Voters to really know why maps were being made the way they were, what data was being used, what their goals were. And there was almost no time for voters to analyze those maps or comment on them. So one of the first things that's good about these new reforms that we're implementing this year is more transparency and more public input. And I just want to say it was the voters, Republican and Democrat, in all 88 states who demanded changes to this. And so once again, it's going to have to be the voters who demand that the letter and spirit of these reforms are upheld this year.
All right, Jen, and I know we've got some specifics on how people can get involved in just a moment, but first we've got to squeeze in a quick break here. If, for those of you at home, grab your cell phone. I see your cat there definitely wants to weigh in on this conversation. Those at home, grab your cell phone, get ready to take a photo. We've got some resources for you. We'll be back with more Backstory in just a moment. Welcome back to Backstory. Let's pick up where we left off. Jen, I understand that gerrymandering is a lot more sophisticated now than it was. In fact, the New York Times opinion piece writer put it this way, and this is a slight paraphrase: gerrymandering used to be an art, but thanks to computers, they've gotten it down to a science. Can you kind of explain that to our audience?
Yeah, so with more precision than ever, map makers can know how voters might behave. And so that's why right now what you see is you could literally have a house in a neighborhood that is surrounded on 3 sides by an entirely different district. All of that is designed to try to dilute as much as possible the minority party votes. And so that's always been the case, but it was more of a pen and paper kind of scenario. Now we have super data, we have supercomputers. And so with much more precision, map makers could end up really picking and choosing voters. So, and that's what we're really talking about, is politicians drawing maps so that they get to pick their voters rather than voters getting to pick who represents them because the way those lines are drawn. But yeah, absolutely, computers are so much stronger now, which is why the transparency in the public participation and these rules around bipartisanship are so important.
Dr. Miller, racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but partisan gerrymandering is not. Do you see a difference?
Well, the Supreme Court sees a difference. I think there were many of us who hoped that in the recent cases that went before the Supreme Court that pertained to partisan gerrymandering, that the Supreme Court would weigh in and would rule that, like racial gerrymandering, in which it's been ruled unconstitutional basically on the grounds that if you draw a district that pulls all the members of a racial minority into a single district, it's a form of what the majority opinion called racial apartheid. Well, the same, some would argue, could be said of if you draw all the members of the minority party and pack them into one district, you're diluting their influence in the legislature because you're making sure that all the other districts are controlled by that other party. So I think there are folks like me who believe that there are definitely some similarities, but the court didn't bite when it came to those several cases where it could have ruled. And so what that means is that in 2022, 2024, in the years ahead, if there are, for instance, any legal challenges to the maps that are redrawn and used in Ohio's state legislative and congressional races, those cases will go through state court and they can be argued to the Ohio Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court of the United States has really taken a pass on that. And I think it's to the real disappointment of reform-minded people like Jen, Deb, and others.
I don't know who wants to take this, but House Bill 1 is also known as For the People Act. It has received some media attention. It would require the president and vice president to disclose 10 years of tax reform. It talks, or tax returns, excuse me. It talks about campaign finance, election reform. But in that, it does address redistricting, and it would make it public and less partisan. Is that federal approach a good idea? And do you see a law at the federal level pertaining to this becoming a reality?
I'm happy to take that, unless you want to, Dr. Dalke. So we are supporters of For the People Act. While we like the reforms that we have here in Ohio, and we're thankful for them, there's many states that have nothing. What is in For the People Act is actually stronger, because instead of right now, what we still have, and again, this is because we were trying to work with Republicans and Democrats to get these issues on the ballot and to get them passed. So what we have are grand compromises that help. They do create guardrails. But For the People Act calls for an independent redistricting commission. So that actually could be not politicians at all, but you could have experts in map making. You could have academics who understand various communities or the census. You could have all these different kinds of folks who represent everyday people of Ohio who are truly just trying to make maps that make sense. And when you are drawing maps with the goal of really having fair representation, they're going to look very different. And you're going to have much different results, much better results than when politicians are drawing them. So that's actually why we keep going back to the fact that we need everyone to participate. If HR 1 passes, in my opinion, we will see more fair maps than we've ever seen before here in Ohio. But in the meantime, we do have these reforms, and it's really important that the governor, that the Secretary of State, that Ohio lawmakers are hearing from voters that they want fair maps, that they want an end to partisan gerrymandering.
And
Dr.
if I could,
go ahead.
yeah, if I could add one thing here, is the reason why a federal law would be important is that once a state does become heavily gerrymandered, then it's up to the state legislature, the people who created the gerrymandering districts, to change it. And why would they? So a state is likely to keep being gerrymandered unless, either in the case of Ohio, where the citizens stepped in and had some initiatives for fairer districts, or there is a federal rule.
And there are states in the country that have no ability for everyday people to bring initiatives like the League did. There are states in the country that cannot go to their state Supreme Court. They literally, the voters have no way to even put any guardrails or limits on partisan gerrymandering. And again, this happens, both parties do it. We know this has been a problem, as you said, since the beginning of the Republic. So a national standard does a couple things. It protects every state, every voter, but it also means our congressional delegation hopefully is selected through fair maps and is working with other congressional delegations in Kentucky and Michigan and Indiana and Pennsylvania that also have fair maps. And that means that the entire region is going to get better policies that better serve us out of the federal government.
And Dr. Dalke, you are holding these virtual town meetings, trying to get people involved. How can people get involved? What are you telling people out there?
Okay, well, one of the first things I would say is join one of these groups. You have the League of Women Voters, you have Common Cause, and then you have Fair Districts, which is an organization that is solely directed towards trying to create these fair districts. So become a citizen activist and get to know your district boundaries. I mean, I had never looked at a map of my districts until a couple of months ago, but think about your own district. Is your community divided unnecessarily or in a way that doesn't make sense? Talk to people. Through Fair Districts, you can be trained to give presentations like I do. You can be trained to help people draw new district maps. You can help Fair Districts monitor what the politicians are doing. You can write your state senators and your state house members, tell them that you want fair districts, because they are going to be the people who actually create the districts. write a letter to the editor. In one of my training presentations, I was told that the representatives, they pay attention to letters that mention them. They want to know what is being said about them in the paper. So write a letter to the editor, and Fair Districts can actually help you. They have tools that if you're a little bit uncomfortable about writing a letter, then they can give you some ideas.
And Jim, we've got about a minute left. What do you say to the person who's overwhelmed by this? They want to get involved, but they don't even know where to start.
Yep. Here's the thing. You don't have to be an expert. That's what we're here for. And again, the League is fiercely nonpartisan. We've been fighting on behalf of voters against bad maps when Republicans and Democrats have done it. So join us, become a member of the League, and you can get our emails, follow us on social media. And again, League is the leader of Fair Districts. So join us there, and we will be your eyes and ears. But we can't just do it. We can be your eyes and ears, but then we need as many people as possible raising their voices in their communities.
All right. Well, thanks to Jen Miller, Dr. Melissa Miller, and Dr. Deb Dalke, and Monster Kitty. We got the cat's name over the break. Appreciate all four of you, and thanks for you at home for watching this edition of BackStory. We'll be back next time.
BackStory is made possible in part by KeyBank, with additional support from the League of Women Voters, and by viewers like you. Thank you.